Elena Vasquez adjusted the small American flag on her classroom bulletin board, her fingers trembling slightly as she straightened the corners. 6 weeks. The number had been echoing in her mind since she'd received the letter from Immigration Services that morning. 6 weeks until her student visa expired. 6 weeks until she'd have to leave Pinewood Elementary, leave Maine, leave the life she'd carefully built from nothing. The October afternoon light streamed through the tall windows of her third-grade classroom, casting golden rectangles across the tiny desks where her students had spent the day learning about autumn leaves and multiplication tables. She'd never imagined, when she first arrived from Columbia 3 years ago to complete her teaching certification, that this small coastal town would become home. But somewhere between organizing the first parent-teacher conference and watching her students' faces light up when they finally grasped a difficult concept, Pinewood had wrapped itself around her heart. A soft knock at the classroom door interrupted her thoughts. Elena turned to see a tall man in a charcoal wool coat standing in the doorway, his dark hair slightly mussed by the October wind. She recognized him immediately. James Whitmore, Tommy's guardian. She'd been expecting him for their conference, though she hadn't expected the way her pulse quickened when their eyes met. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, gesturing to the small chair across from her desk. "Please come in." He moved with quiet confidence, folding his long frame into the child-sized furniture with good humor. "Thank you for staying late, Miss Vasquez. I know Tommy's been looking forward to this conference all week." Elena smiled, pulling Tommy's folder from her desk drawer. "He's a wonderful student, very bright, very kind to his classmates." She paused, noting the way James's expression softened when she mentioned his nephew. "He talks about you often. It's clear he adores you." "The feeling is mutual," James said quietly. "He's been through so much this past year, losing his parents. Moving here with me, it hasn't been easy for either of us, but you've made the transition smoother than I could have hoped." Something in his voice, a carefully controlled vulnerability, made Elena look up from Tommy's file. She found James studying her with an intensity that sent warmth spreading through her chest. For a moment, the professional distance she maintained with all parents seemed to evaporate. "Tommy is resilient," she said softly. "Children often are. They adapt when they feel safe and loved." "And what about adults?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning. Neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Adults, we're more complicated." They spent the next 20 minutes discussing Tommy's progress, but Elena found herself stealing glances at James when he wasn't looking. She noticed the way he listened intently to every word about his nephew's social development, the way his eyes crinkled slightly when he smiled, the way he seemed genuinely interested when he asked about her teaching philosophy. As they concluded the conference, James stood and extended his hand. "Thank you again, Miss Vasquez. Tommy is lucky to have you as his teacher." Elena took his hand, immediately aware of the warmth of his skin, the gentle strength of his grip. "Please, call me Elena." Elena. Her name sounded different in his voice, softer somehow. "I'm James." Thunder rumbled outside, and they both turned toward the windows, where the first fat drops of rain were beginning to streak the glass. "Looks like the storm finally arrived," James said, pulling his coat tighter. "I heard on the radio it's supposed to be quite severe." Elena glanced at her small Honda in the parking lot, already being pelted by increasingly heavy drops. She'd been dreading the drive home in weather like this. Her car had been making concerning noises lately, and the winding coastal roads could be treacherous in a storm. "Miss Vasquez." "Elena," James corrected himself. "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but your car looks like it might have trouble in this weather. Could I offer you a ride home?" The sensible part of her mind whispered warnings about accepting. Rides from parents, about maintaining professional boundaries. But the rain was coming down harder now, and something about James's quiet concern made her feel safer rather than more vulnerable. That's very kind of you. Thank you. James's SUV was warm and spacious, with the subtle scent of leather and his cologne. As they pulled out of the school parking lot, the rain began in earnest, drumming against the windshield in a steady rhythm that seemed to create an intimate cocoon around them. "Have you lived in Pinewood long?" Elena asked, surprised by how natural conversation felt with him. "About 2 years. I moved here after my brother died." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Elena heard the pain underneath. "I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere Tommy could heal." "What about you?" 3 years. I came to finish my teaching certification." She hesitated, then added, "I never planned to stay this long." "But you did stay." "Yes." The simple word carried the weight of everything she couldn't say. How Pinewood had become her refuge. How the thought of leaving made her chest tight with panic. They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the storm creating a sense of intimacy in the warm vehicle. Elena found herself studying James's profile as he navigated the rain-slicked roads, noting the concentration in his expression, the competent way he handled the car. "Elena," he said suddenly, "I hope this isn't presumptuous, but I couldn't help overhearing some of the conversation at the school board meeting last month. About your visa situation." Elena's stomach clenched. She'd hoped that particular piece of information hadn't spread beyond the administration, but in a town like Pinewood, privacy was a luxury few could afford. "It's complicated," she said. "Carefully. If you ever need help, legal advice, references, anything, please don't hesitate to ask. Tommy has flourished under your teaching, and frankly, so have I. Watching him regain his confidence, his joy in learning, you've given us both a gift." The sincerity in his voice made Elena's throat tight with emotion. She'd grown used to handling her problems alone, to being careful not to burden others with her complicated status. The offer of help, given so freely and without judgment, felt like a lifeline she was afraid to grasp. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." As they pulled into the driveway of her small rental cottage, the rain had reached a crescendo, pounding the roof of the car with impressive force. Elena made no immediate move to get out, and James made no move to hurry her. "I should let you get inside before this gets worse," he said finally, though his tone suggested he was as reluctant as she was to end their time together. "James," she said, turning to face him in the dim light of the car's interior, "thank you, not just for the ride, but for being kind. Not everyone has been." Something flickered across his expression, understanding, anger on her behalf, and something deeper that made her breath catch. "Their narrow-mindedness is their loss," he said quietly. "Anyone who can't see what an asset you are to this community is a fool." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. It had been so long since someone had defended her, had seen her value rather than just her complications. "I should go," she said, though she didn't move. "Elena," James said, his voice lower now, more intimate. "If you need anything at all, I know." She met his eyes, feeling something pass between them that had nothing to do with teacher, conferences, or community politics. "Good night, James." She ran through the rain to her front door, feeling his eyes on her until she was safely inside. Only then did she hear his car pull away into the storm. That night, Elena lay awake listening to the rain against her windows and thinking about the warmth in James's voice when he'd said her name. She thought about his offer of help, about the way he'd looked at her in the car, about the impossible situation she found herself in. 6 weeks to find a solution to her visa problem or return to Colombia and face the life she'd fled, including Carlos, whose increasingly desperate messages she'd been ignoring for months. The next morning brought crisp October air and a phone call that changed everything. Elena's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who worked at the town hall, called with news that made Elena's heart sink. "Dear," Mrs. Patterson said without preamble, "I thought you should know. There's been talk at the morning coffee group about your situation. Some of the parents are concerned about stability in the classroom, wondering if the school should be making other arrangements for the rest of the year." Elena closed her eyes, leaning against her kitchen counter. "I see. Now, I want you to know that not everyone feels that way, but Helen Morrison has been quite vocal, and she has influence with the school board. I thought you deserved a warning." After hanging up, Elena stared out her kitchen window at the aftermath of the storm. Broken branches littered her small yard, and puddles reflected the grey morning sky. She thought about James's offer of help, about the connection she'd felt sitting in his car in the rain. But involving him would only complicate things further, might even damage his own standing in the community. She was still contemplating her limited options when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Found your number in Tommy's backpack. Hope that's okay. Just wanted to make sure you got home safely last night. James." Elena stared at the message for a long moment, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She started to type a simple "thank you", then stopped, started again, finally settled on, "Thank you for checking, and thank you again for the ride." It meant a great deal. His response came quickly, "Anytime. I meant what I said about helping if you need anything." Elena set the phone down and walked to her bedroom, where she pulled out the return ticket to Bogota that her family had sent weeks ago, just in case. She'd hidden it in her dresser drawer, unable to bring herself to look at it. Now she held it up to the morning light, seeing her future reflected in the small piece of paper. 6 weeks to choose between an uncertain fight to stay and the safety of retreat. 6 weeks to decide if the connection she'd felt with James was worth the risk of hope. 6 weeks to determine whether love, if that's what this was, could be stronger than fear. Outside, she could hear the sounds of Pinewood waking up. Children's voices carrying on the wind, the distant horn of the morning ferry, the comforting rhythm of a life she might soon have to leave behind. But for the first time since receiving the visa letter, Elena allowed herself to wonder what might happen if she chose to fight instead of flee. The autumn festival at Pinewood Elementary had always been Elena's favorite school event. The gymnasium, transformed into a wonderland of orange and gold streamers, pumpkin displays, and handmade crafts created by enthusiastic 8-year-olds. This year, however, Elena felt the weight of curious glances and hushed conversations as she hung decorations. Alongside the other teachers and parent volunteers, "Elena, could you help me with this banner?" She turned to find James approaching with one end of a large "Welcome Fall" sign, his smile warm despite the early morning hour. He'd volunteered for the setup committee, something that surprised Elena, given his busy schedule running his tech company remotely from Pinewood. "Of course," she said, taking the other end. Together they stretched the banner across the gymnasium entrance, their hands brushing as they adjusted the placement. Each brief contact sent awareness spiraling through Elena, a dangerous distraction she couldn't afford. "Higher on your end," James suggested, and Elena stood on her tiptoes, trying to reach the hook. She wobbled slightly, and suddenly James was behind her, his hands steadying her waist. "Careful," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Elena's pulse hammered as she secured the banner, hyper-aware of James's solid presence behind her, the way his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back. When she turned around, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. "Thank you," she said softly, and the simple words seemed to carry far more weight than they should have. "Always," he replied, his voice equally quiet. Their moment was interrupted by the arrival of Mrs. Morrison, the PTA president, whose perfectly styled grey hair never moved despite the October breeze that swept through the open gym doors. She surveyed their handiwork with the critical eye of someone accustomed to finding fault. "The banner is crooked," she announced, though it clearly wasn't. "And Miss Vasquez, shouldn't you be setting up the craft tables rather than this?" Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks at the subtle dismissal. "I was just helping." "I asked for Elena's help," James interjected smoothly, his tone pleasant, but carrying an undertone that made Mrs. Morrison's eyes narrow slightly. The banner needed 2 people, and she was gracious enough to assist. Mrs. Morrison's smile was razor-sharp. How thoughtful, though I'm sure Miss Vasquez has plenty to keep her busy, considering her uncertain schedule. The words hit there. Mark and Elena saw James's expression harden. Before he could respond, she touched his arm lightly, a gentle warning. "The craft tables do need attention," Elena said diplomatically. "Excuse me?" She walked away, feeling James's frustrated gaze. On her back, hearing Mrs. Morrison's satisfied hum, the message was clear. Know your place, remember your precarious position. The festival itself went smoothly, filled with children's laughter and the warm chaos of community celebration. Elena ran the face-painting booth, transforming small faces into butterflies, lions, and superheroes with practiced ease. She was adding whiskers to a particularly squirmy kindergartner when Tommy appeared at her table. "Miss Elena, can you paint me like a dragon? Uncle James says dragons are brave and protect what they care about." Elena's heart melted as she reached for her green face paint. "Of course, sweetheart. What kind of dragon would you like to be?" "The kind that keeps people safe," Tommy said seriously, making Elena's throat tight with emotion. As she painted intricate scales and fierce eyebrows, Elena was aware of James watching from across the gym, where he manned the ring toss booth. Their eyes met frequently throughout the afternoon, small moments of connection that felt stolen and precious. Later, as they cleaned up after the festival, Elena found herself working alongside James again, this time stacking chairs in comfortable silence. The gym had mostly emptied, leaving only a few dedicated volunteers to handle the aftermath. "Coffee?" James asked suddenly, producing a thermos from his jacket. "I made extra this morning." Elena nodded gratefully, accepting the warm cup he poured. For her. The coffee was perfect, rich and dark with just a hint of cinnamon, exactly how she preferred it, though she'd never mentioned her preference to him. "How did you know?" she asked, surprised. James looked slightly embarrassed. "I pay attention to things. At the parent conferences, during school events, you always seem to gravitate toward the cinnamon pastries, and you add extra cinnamon to the coffee in the teacher's lounge." The realization that he'd been watching her so carefully sent warmth spreading through Elena's chest. It had been years since anyone had noticed such small details about her preferences, her habits. "That's very observant of you," she said softly. "When something matters to you, you pay attention," he replied, his meaning unmistakable. They shared the coffee in quiet intimacy, the autumn light streaming through the gym windows growing golden as afternoon shifted toward evening. Elena found herself studying James's profile, the way concentration furrowed his brow as he wound up extension cords, the competent movements of his hands. "James," she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the questions that had been building. In her mind, questions about his intentions, about the careful distance he maintained in public despite the obvious attraction between them. "I know," he said quietly, understanding without explanation. "I know it's complicated." Before Elena could respond, the gym doors burst open and Mrs. Morrison returned with 2 other PTA board members, their voices carrying clearly across the empty space. "I'm just saying," Mrs. Morrison was explaining to her companions, "we need to think about stability for the children. These people come and go without warning, leaving the kids confused and abandoned. Is that really what we want for our school? Elena froze, James's sharp intake of breath telling her he'd heard every word. The coffee cup shook in her hands as the familiar shame washed over her. The shame of being reduced to these people, of having her dedication and love for her students dismissed so casually. "Helen," one of the other women said uncomfortably, "don't you think that's a bit harsh?" "Harsh? It's realistic. My sources tell me her visa situation is quite precarious. Why should we invest in someone who might disappear at any moment?" James started to move toward the women, his expression thunderous, but Elena grabbed his arm, shaking her head urgently. Making a scene would only prove their point, would only give them more ammunition to use against her. The women eventually left, their voices fading as they headed toward the parking lot. Elena and James stood frozen in the aftermath, the golden afternoon light suddenly feeling cold and brittle. "Elena," James said finally, his voice rough with suppressed anger, "you can't let them talk about you that way." "What choice do I have?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "Fighting back will only make it worse. You don't understand what it's like to be expendable." "You're not expendable," he said fiercely. "You're one of the best teachers this school has ever had. Tommy adores you, and so do the other children. This community is better because you're in it." Elena felt tears threatening and turned away, not wanting him to see her weakness. "It doesn't matter what I am if they don't want me here." James moved closer, his presence warm and solid behind her. "Some people don't want you here. Others do." "I do." The quiet intensity of his words made Elena turn back to face him. In the golden light filtering through the gym windows, James looked like something from a dream, strong, protective, impossibly handsome, and dangerous to her carefully guarded heart. "James," she whispered, not sure if his name was a warning or a plea. He reached up, almost touching her face before catching himself and letting his hand fall. "I wish things were simpler." "So do I." They finished cleaning in heavy silence. The easy companionship of earlier replaced by the weight of everything they couldn't say, couldn't do. As they prepared to leave, James turned to Elena one last time. "The school board meeting is next week," he said, "to discuss your contract extension." Elena nodded, her stomach clenching. She'd been trying not to think about the meeting, about the likelihood that Mrs. Morrison's influence would carry the day. "I plan to be there," James continued, "to speak in support of keeping you." "James, no." Elena's response was immediate and sharp. "You can't. It will only make things worse for both of us." "I won't stand by and watch them destroy you," he said, with quiet determination. "And I won't watch them destroy you because of me." Elena met his eyes steadily. "You have a business to think about, Tommy, to consider. Getting involved in my situation could damage your reputation in this community." "I don't care about my reputation." "Well, I do." The words came out harder than Elena intended, born of fear and frustration. "I care about what happens to you, what happens to Tommy. And I won't be responsible for making your lives more difficult." James stared at her for a long moment, something like hurt flickering across his features. "So what do you suggest? That I just watch silently while they push you out?" "I suggest you let me handle my own problems," Elena said, hating herself, even as the words left her mouth. But it was better this way, safer for both of them, if she maintained distance. James nodded slowly, his expression closing off. "Of course. I'm sorry for presuming." He walked away without another word, leaving Elena alone in the empty gymnasium with her coffee cup growing cold in her hands and the taste of regret bitter in her mouth. That evening, as Elena sat in her cottage grading papers and trying not to think about the hurt in James's eyes, her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was all too recognizable. Bogota. Elena? Mi amor, you haven't been answering my messages. Carlos's voice sent ice through Elena's veins, the familiar endearment that had once made her heart flutter. Now making her skin crawl. Carlos, I told you not to call me, but I've changed, Elena. I've been in therapy, working on my anger issues. I know I hurt you before, but I'm different now. Come home to me, let me prove it. Elena closed her eyes, memories of their relationship flooding back, the initial charm, the gradual isolation from friends and family, the walking on eggshells, the final violent confrontation that had sent her fleeing to the United States with nothing but a scholarship and desperate hope. I am home, she said quietly. That place isn't your home. These people will never truly accept you, Elena. You know this. Come back where you belong, where people understand you. The terrible thing was that part of his words rang true. Elena had felt the weight of being an outsider every day since Mrs. Morrison had started her campaign of subtle harassment. The stares, the whispered conversations, the careful distance some parents maintained. I have to go, Elena said, her hand trembling as she prepared to hang up. Elena, wait. I know about your visa problem. My cousin works in immigration services. If you come back willingly, there won't be any issues with future travel. But if you're forced to return, the implication hung in the air like a threat. Elena ended the call without responding, but Carlos's words echoed in her mind as she sat alone in her cottage, surrounded by student papers and the gathering darkness of October night. Outside her window, Pinewood slept peacefully, the community. She'd grown to love, completely unaware that one of its members was slowly being pushed toward a choice between the devil she knew and the uncertain future she'd tried to build. Elena pulled out the return ticket to Bogota again, staring at the dates. 4 weeks now. 4 weeks to decide whether James's support was worth the risk to both their futures, or whether love, if that's what this was, should sometimes mean letting go. Elena stared at the envelope that had been slipped under her classroom door sometime. During the night, her name was written across the front in block letters that revealed nothing about the sender's identity. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper with a message that made her blood run cold. Stop encouraging that Whitmore man, or you'll both regret it. Some of us have long memories and strong connections. It was Wednesday morning, 2 days before the school board meeting that would determine her future at Pinewood Elementary. Elena's hands shook as she reread the anonymous threat, trying to understand what long memories and strong connections could possibly mean. A soft knock at her classroom door made her jump. She quickly folded the letter and slipped it into her desk drawer before calling out, "Come in." James appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 coffee cups from the local diner. His expression was carefully neutral, the easy warmth of their earlier interactions replaced by polite distance. They hadn't spoken privately since their conversation after the autumn festival, though Elena had felt his eyes on her during school events. "Peace offering?" he said, holding out one of the cups. "I brought cinnamon." Elena accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that he'd remembered her preference despite their recent tension. "Thank you. You didn't have to." "I wanted to apologize." James interrupted. "For pushing when you asked me not to, for presuming I knew what was best." Elena felt her throat tighten. "James, let me finish, please." He moved closer, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "I've been thinking about what you said, about handling your own problems. You're right that getting involved could complicate things for both of us. But I need you to know something." Elena waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I've been receiving letters," James said quietly. "Anonymous messages warning me to stay away from the foreign teacher or face consequences for my business. At first, I thought it was just small-town prejudice, but the threats are getting more specific. Someone knows details about my company, about pending contracts. Elena's coffee cup slipped in her hands, and James reached out instinctively to steady it, his fingers warm against hers. "That's why you've been distant," she whispered, understanding, flooding through her. "You were trying to protect me, and you've been trying to protect me." James's smile was rueful. "We're quite a pair, aren't we?" Elena thought about the letter hidden in her desk drawer, about Carlos's veiled threats during their phone conversation. "James, I need to show you something." She retrieved the anonymous message, watching James's expression darken as he read the threatening words. "This is escalating beyond simple prejudice," he said grimly. "Someone is actively working to intimidate both of us." But who and why? Before James could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside Elena's classroom. They moved apart quickly, James taking several steps back and Elena busying herself with shuffling papers on her desk. Mrs. Patterson, Elena's neighbor who worked at the town hall, appeared in the doorway, looking flustered. "Elena, dear, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I thought you should know. The school board meeting has been moved up to tomorrow afternoon. There's been some kind of pressure applied, though nobody's saying exactly what." Elena's stomach dropped. Tomorrow meant she'd have one less day to prepare, one less day to find support among the community members who had remained neutral in the growing controversy. "Pressure from whom?" James asked sharply. Mrs. Patterson glanced around nervously, before lowering her voice. "I probably shouldn't say this, but there's been talk about business deals, about investors reconsidering projects in Pinewood due to concerns about the community atmosphere. Helen Morrison has been making calls all morning, very pleased about something." After Mrs. Patterson left, Elena and James stared at each other in growing understanding. "Someone is using economic pressure to force the board's hand," James said slowly. "They're making it seem like keeping you will damage the town's business prospects." "Your business prospects," Elena corrected, pieces falling into place. "Someone wants to hurt you financially and sees me as the perfect weapon." James was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight with controlled anger. "There's only one person who has both the motive and the connections to pull something like this off." "Who?" "Richard Blackstone. He owns a tech consulting firm that competes directly with mine. We've been bidding against each other for the same contracts for years. He's based in Boston, but has been trying to establish a foothold in coastal Maine." Elena felt a chill of recognition. "I've heard that name before. Wasn't he interested in some property here in town?" "The waterfront development project. He lost the bid to a consortium I'm part of. If he can discredit me personally, make it seem like I'm a liability to the community, the other investors might reconsider their partnership." The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Elena wasn't just a victim of small-town prejudice. She was a pawn in a larger game of business rivalry and economic manipulation. "So what do we do?" Elena asked. James met her eyes with new determination. "We fight back together." That evening, Elena found herself in James's home for the first time, a beautifully restored Victorian that overlooked Pinewood Harbor. Tommy was staying with a friend for the night, giving them privacy to plan their strategy for the school board meeting. James's study was warm and inviting, lined with books and filled with the soft glow of lamplight. Elena sat curled in a leather armchair while James paced behind his desk, both of them surrounded by printed emails, financial documents, and copies of the threatening letters they'd each received. "I've been doing some research on Blackstone," James said, pulling up files on his laptop. "His pattern is consistent. He finds ways to discredit competitors using personal attacks and community pressure. 3 years ago, he destroyed a rival's reputation in Portland by spreading rumors about tax evasion." Elena studied the timeline James had created, noting the correlation between escalating threats and key business milestones. It's so calculated, using people's prejudices as weapons. The brilliant part is that he doesn't have to create the prejudice, James said grimly. He just has to amplify what already exists and direct it toward his purpose. They worked late into the evening, building their case and preparing for the school board meeting. As the night wore on, Elena found herself stealing glances at James, noting the way concentrated thought furrowed his brow, the competent movements of his hands as he sorted through documents. "Elena," he said suddenly, looking up from his laptop, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Elena's pulse quickened. "Of course. Are you planning to leave Pinewood regardless of what happens at the school board meeting?" The question hung between them, loaded with everything they hadn't said about their growing feelings for each other. Elena considered lying, considered protecting them both from the vulnerability of truth. Instead, she met his eyes steadily. "I don't know," she said quietly. "My visa situation is still precarious. Even if the board votes to keep me, that doesn't solve the underlying problem. And there are other factors, such as—" Elena hesitated, then decided James deserved to know about Carlos's increasingly aggressive contact attempts. She told him about the phone calls, the implied threats, the pressure from her family to return to Colombia, where things were familiar and safe. James listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "So you're being pressured from multiple directions," he said finally. "Blackstone here, your ex-boyfriend in Colombia, visa complications from the federal government. And you," Elena said softly, "being with you, caring about you, it complicates everything." James crossed the room to kneel beside her chair, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "Elena, I need you to understand something. Whatever happens with the business deals, whatever Blackstone tries to do to me professionally, it's worth it. You're worth it." Elena's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice. "James, I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "Maybe I've been falling since that first parent conference, since the ride home in the rain, and if fighting for us means risking everything else, then that's a risk I'm willing to take." Elena felt tears spring to her eyes. The words she'd been afraid to even think were reflected back to her in James's steady gaze. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "That's what makes this so terrifying." James reached up to cup her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts to contain it. "Then we fight," he said firmly. "Tomorrow at the school board meeting we present our evidence. We expose Blackstone's manipulation and show the community what's really happening here." Elena leaned into his touch, allowing herself a moment of hope. "And if it doesn't work, if they vote to terminate my contract anyway, then we'll figure out the next step together," James promised. "But Elena, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you won't make any decisions about leaving without talking to me first. Promise me you won't run." Elena thought about the return ticket to Bogota, hidden in her dresser drawer, about the escape route that had seemed so necessary just days before. Looking into James's eyes, feeling the strength of his conviction, she found herself nodding. "I promise," James smiled then, the first truly relaxed smile she'd seen from him in weeks. He leaned forward, and Elena thought he might kiss her, but instead he rested his forehead against hers, breathing her in. "We're going to be okay," he murmured. And for the first time in months, Elena allowed herself to believe it might be true. The next morning brought devastating news. Elena arrived at school to find Mrs. Morrison holding court in the main office, her voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. 3 major investors have expressed concerns about the stability of our educational system, Mrs. Morrison was saying to Principal Davis. They're questioning whether Pinewood is the right kind of community for their families if we can't even maintain consistent staffing. Elena's heart sank as she realized their research into Blackstone's tactics had come too late. He'd already moved to the next phase of his plan, using economic pressure to create an impossible situation for the school board. By lunchtime, the news had spread throughout the small town. James texted Elena with updates from his own network. 2 key investors in the waterfront development had called emergency meetings, and rumors were circulating about foreign influences undermining local institutions. Elena sat in her empty classroom, during lunch, staring at the student artwork covering her bulletin boards, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed her sister's number in Bogotá. Elena, thank God you answered. Carlos called us this morning. He says there are problems with your visa, that you might be forced to return. Mama is sick with worry. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the walls closing in from all sides. Maria, it's complicated. Carlos says he can help fix everything if you come home. He has connections, Elena. People who can make sure you don't have problems traveling in the future. And what does he want in return? Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. There was a pause before Maria continued more quietly. He wants another chance. Elena, maybe that's not such a terrible thing. You've been gone 3 years. People change. Elena thought about the bruises that had finally faded from her ribs by the time she'd arrived in Maine, about the terror that had driven her to flee everything familiar. People could change, but Carlos's recent phone calls suggested his transformation was more about control than genuine growth. I have to go, Elena said, ending the call before Maria could apply more pressure. That afternoon, Elena and James sat in the front row of the packed Pinewood Town Hall, surrounded by parents, teachers, and community members who had come to witness the school board's decision. Elena recognized supporters and detractors alike, the familiar faces of a community divided. Mrs. Morrison presented the board's concerns with practiced efficiency, citing investor feedback and community stability as primary factors in their decision. She never mentioned Elena by name, but her meaning was unmistakable. When James rose to speak in Elena's defense, the room fell silent. He presented their research methodically, exposing the connection between the anonymous threats and Richard, Blackstone's business interests. Several board members looked genuinely surprised by the evidence of external manipulation. Miss Vasquez isn't just a teacher, James concluded, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. She's a dedicated educator who has transformed the lives of our children. To lose her because of one man's business, vendetta would be a tragedy this community will regret. Elena felt a surge of hope as several parents nodded in agreement. Tommy's friend's mother stood up to testify about Elena's impact on her son's confidence. Other voices joined in, creating a groundswell of support that seemed to surprise even Mrs. Morrison. The board voted 4-3 in Elena's favor, agreeing to honor her contract through the end of the school year. Elena felt tears of relief as James squeezed her hand, their first public display of connection witnessed by the entire community, but their victory was short-lived. As they walked out of the town hall together, Elena felt lighter than she had in months. The evening air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the harbour sparkled with the lights of fishing boats returning home. James took her hand openly, no longer hiding their connection. "We did it," Elena said, still hardly believing the outcome. "We did," James agreed, lifting their joined hands to press a kiss to her knuckles. "I told you we made a good team." They had dinner at the small restaurant overlooking the harbour, celebrating with quiet joy. The other diners occasionally glanced their way, some with curiosity, others with newfound respect. Elena found herself relaxing into the public acknowledgement of their relationship, the relief of no longer hiding her feelings. It wasn't until they returned to Elena's cottage that everything began to unravel. Elena's car sat in her driveway, but something was wrong. As they approached, James's grip on her hand tightened. The word "Go home" had been spray-painted across her windshield in stark red letters, and all 4 tires had been slashed. Tucked under the windshield wiper was another note. "You won this round, but the game isn't over. Leave town by Sunday, or things get worse for both of you." James immediately called the police, while Elena stood frozen, staring at the vandalism. This wasn't just about business anymore. Someone was escalating to direct intimidation and property damage. By the time they finished filing the police report, it was nearly midnight. James insisted on staying the night, sleeping on Elena's couch to ensure her safety, but neither of them slept well, both listening for sounds that might indicate further harassment. The next morning brought worse news. James received a call from his lead investor in the waterfront development project. "I'm sorry, Whitmore, but the other partners are spooked. There are rumors about your involvement with radical elements, questions about your judgment. We're pulling out of the project." Elena watched James's face fall as he absorbed the financial implications. The waterfront development represented 2 years of work and a significant portion of his company's projected revenue. "How much?" Elena asked quietly after he hung up. "Enough to seriously damage the business," James admitted. "I'll have to lay off employees, maybe relocate the company entirely." Elena felt sick. Despite their victory at the school board meeting, Blackstone was winning the larger war. The personal cost to James was becoming too high to justify. That afternoon, while James met with his lawyer and insurance company, Elena made a decision that she knew would break both their hearts. She called the airline and changed her return ticket to Colombia, moving her departure date to Sunday, just 2 days away. She spent the evening writing a letter she prayed she'd never have to send, explaining to James why she had to leave, why their love, however real and profound, couldn't justify the destruction being wreaked on his life and livelihood. Elena was sealing the envelope when her phone rang. James's name appeared on the caller ID, and her heart clenched with guilt. "Elena, I have news," he said, his voice strange with excitement. "The police traced the IP address of the threatening emails. They're all coming from Richard Blackstone's office in Boston. They're arresting him tonight on charges of harassment and intimidation." Elena's hand flew to her mouth. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious. And it gets better." Apparently, Blackstone made the mistake of using his corporate email for some of his communications with local contacts. The FBI found evidence of a conspiracy to manipulate local politics for business gain. The waterfront investors are already calling to apologize. Elena felt the room spin around her. The threat that had seemed so insurmountable was crumbling. The enemy who had seemed invincible was being exposed and prosecuted. "Elena, are you there?" "I'm here," she whispered, staring at the letter she'd been prepared to leave for him. At the suitcase she'd already begun packing. "It's over," James said, his voice warm with relief and something deeper. "We're free to build whatever we want together." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision she'd almost made. She had been prepared to sacrifice their love to protect him, just as he had been prepared to sacrifice his business to protect her. The realization of how close they'd come to losing each other made her legs weak. "James," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm coming over," he said, understanding without explanation that she needed him there. 20 minutes later, Elena opened her door to find James standing on her porch, with Tommy beside him, both of them grinning widely. "We brought celebratory ice cream," Tommy announced, holding up a container of her favorite flavor. Elena looked from the 8-year-old's eager face to James's tender expression and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. This was her family, she realized, not by blood or law, but by choice and commitment and the daily decision to show up for each other. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to welcome them home. Elena stood at her kitchen window the following Saturday morning, watching James and Tommy build a snowman in her small backyard. The first snow of the season had arrived overnight, transforming Pinewood into a winter wonderland that seemed to mirror the transformation in her own life. A week had passed since Blackstone's arrest, and the change in the community's attitude had been remarkable. Parents who had whispered behind Elena's back now smiled and waved when she passed on the street. The school board had unanimously voted to support her application for a work visa, providing official documentation of her value to the educational system. But despite these victories, Elena found herself struggling with a different kind of uncertainty. The immediate threats had been removed, yet the underlying questions about her future remained unanswered. Her student visa would still expire, and the path to permanent residency was complex and uncertain. More troubling were the phone calls from Colombia that had intensified since news of her stability in Pinewood had reached her family. Carlos had grown increasingly desperate and demanding, while her mother applied gentle but persistent pressure for Elena to return home where she belonged. Elena was lost in these thoughts when Tommy burst through the kitchen door, his cheeks red with cold and excitement. "Miss Elena, Uncle James says you're sad about something, but he won't tell me what. Are you sad because of the snow? Some people don't like winter." Elena smiled despite her melancholy, kneeling to help Tommy out of his snow-covered jacket. "I love winter, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups just have complicated feelings about things." Tommy considered this with the seriousness that 8-year-olds brought to adult mysteries. "Is it because you might have to go away? Uncle James gets quiet sometimes when people talk about you leaving." Eleanor's heart clenched. She tried to shield Tommy from her uncertainties, but children were more perceptive than adults often realized. "Tommy," she said carefully, "how would you feel if I had to go away?" "I'd be very sad," Tommy said without hesitation. "You're important. You make Uncle James smile the way he used to before Mommy and Daddy died. And you help me with my reading, and you always remember to cut the crusts off my sandwiches during lunch." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. The simple honesty of a child's love was almost harder to bear than adult complications. "Would you still love me if I lived far away?" she asked softly. Tommy looked at her as if she'd asked a silly question. "Of course, love doesn't stop just because someone goes away, but it's better when people you love stay close." Before Elena could respond, James appeared in the kitchen doorway, stamping snow from his boots. His eyes immediately found Elena's face, noting the emotional conversation he'd interrupted. "Tommy, why don't you go get cleaned up? We'll have hot chocolate in a few minutes." After Tommy left, James moved to stand beside Elena at the window, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Want to tell me what's troubling you?" he asked quietly. Elena stared out at the snow-covered landscape, gathering courage for the conversation they'd been avoiding. "James, what are we doing?" "I thought we were building a relationship," he said carefully. "Was I wrong?" "No, but—" Elena struggled to find the words. "My visa situation is still precarious. Even with the school's support, the process could take years, and there are no guarantees. And my family, Carlos, the pressure to return is getting stronger." James was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. "Are you asking me what I want, or are you telling me what you think we should do?" "I don't know," Elena admitted. "Both, maybe. James, you've already risked so much for me. Your business, your standing in the community, Tommy's stability. How can I ask you to risk more for an uncertain future?" James turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Elena, can I tell you something about the day my brother died?" Elena nodded, surprised by the shift in conversation. "David called me that morning," James continued. "He was driving to work, and we were talking about Tommy's birthday party, about whether he should learn piano or guitar, ordinary things, future plans, and then—" James's voice caught slightly. Then there was the sound of screeching brakes, and the line went dead. Elena reached out instinctively, covering his hand with hers. "For months afterward, I was consumed by regret," James said. "Regret that we hadn't said goodbye properly, that I'd never told him how proud I was of the father he'd become, that I'd taken for granted we had endless time for all the conversations we'd never have." He turned his hand palm up, intertwining their fingers. "When I met you, when I realized I was falling in love with you, I promised myself I wouldn't make the same mistake twice. I wouldn't let fear of an uncertain future rob me of whatever time we might have together." Elena felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "But what if I can't stay? What if we fight for this and lose anyway? Then we'll have tried," James said simply. "Elena, I can't promise you that everything will work out perfectly. Immigration law is complex, and visa applications get denied every day. What I can promise is that whatever happens, we'll face it together." "Together," Elena repeated softly, as if testing the word. "There's something else," James said, his voice gaining strength. "Something I've been researching while you've been worrying." He pulled out his phone, showing Elena a bookmarked webpage about various immigration options. "There are several paths we could explore. A work visa sponsor through my company, since I have contracts that could justify hiring specialized talent. Or," he hesitated, then continued, "or marriage to a U.S. citizen, which would change your status immediately." Elena's breath caught. "James, I'm not proposing," he said quickly, though his eyes held something that made her heart race. "Not yet, but I want you to know that option exists, when and if you're ready. Because, Elena, I don't just want to date you or have a relationship with you. I want to build a life with you." Before Elena could respond, Tommy's voice called from the living room. "Are we having hot chocolate or not? I'm freezing." James smiled ruefully. "To be continued?" Elena nodded, her mind spinning with possibilities she'd been afraid to consider. As they prepared hot chocolate and settled in the living room with Tommy, she found herself studying the domestic scene with new eyes. James reading the newspaper while Tommy worked on a puzzle, the easy rhythm of their Saturday morning routine, the way they both instinctively made space for her in their orbit. This could be her life, she realized, not just temporarily, not just until the next crisis, but permanently. The thought was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. That afternoon, while James worked in his study and Tommy napped on the couch, Elena made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to her sister in Colombia. "Maria, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." She explained about James, about Tommy, about the life she'd built in Pinewood. She talked about her work at the school, about feeling valued and needed in ways that had nothing to do with romantic love. She described the community that had rallied around her during the school board crisis, the friends who had stood up for her when it mattered. "I'm not running away anymore," Elena concluded. "I'm choosing to stay and fight for what I want." Maria was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was sad but understanding. "Carlos won't like this. Carlos doesn't get a vote in my life," Elena said firmly, "and neither does anyone else who thinks fear is a good enough reason to abandon happiness." "What? About Mama? She'll be heartbroken." Elena felt the familiar tug of guilt and obligation. "Then maybe she needs to decide what's more important, having me geographically close or having me truly happy." The second call was to an immigration lawyer in Portland that James had recommended. Elena made an appointment for the following weak to explore her options officially, legally, without the pressure of crisis or the weight of other people's expectations. As she hung up from the second call, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years: the solid certainty of a decision made from love rather than fear. James appeared in the kitchen as she was starting dinner, moving behind her to wrap his arms around her waist as she stirred sauce on the stove. "You seem different," he murmured against her hair. "Lighter." Elena leaned back against his chest, reveling in the simple pleasure of being held. "I made some calls today. To my sister, to the immigration lawyer you mentioned." She felt James's sharp intake of breath. And I told Maria I'm staying. I told her I'm done making decisions based on other people's fears." Elena turned in his arms to face him. "I'm staying, James. I'm staying and fighting for this, for us." The smile that spread across James's face was brilliant, transforming his features with pure joy. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around the small kitchen while she laughed. "Are you sure?" he asked, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "Elena, are you absolutely sure?" "I'm sure," she said, and meant it completely for the first time since she'd received that first threatening letter months ago. "I'm sure I love you. I'm sure I love Tommy. I'm sure I love the life we're building together." James cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing over her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. "I love you too, more than I thought possible." This time, when he leaned down to kiss her, Elena didn't pull away. She rose on her tiptoes to meet him, pouring all her hope and commitment into the connection between them. The kiss was gentle, but certain, a promise and a celebration rolled into one perfect moment. "Uncle James, Miss Elena, the sauce is burning!" They broke apart laughing as Tommy's voice carried from the living room, reality intruding on their romantic moment in the most perfectly domestic way possible. Elena started toward the stove. "We should," James corrected, moving with her to rescue dinner. "From now on, we do everything together." 6 months later, Elena stood in the same lighthouse where she and James had sheltered during that first rainstorm, wearing a simple white dress and holding a bouquet of wildflowers. The immigration lawyer had been optimistic about her work visa application, but James had proposed anyway, not as an immigration solution, but as a celebration of the life they'd chosen to build together. The ceremony was small, attended by the Pinewood community that had become Elena's chosen family. Mrs. Patterson cried openly during the vows, while even Mrs. Morrison managed a grudging smile of approval. Tommy served as ring-bearer with the seriousness of someone entrusted with a sacred mission. As Eleanor and James exchanged rings with the Maine coast stretching endlessly behind them, she thought about all the choices that had led to this moment. The choice to flee Colombia, the choice to stay in Pinewood, the choice to fight for love instead of surrendering to fear. "You may kiss the bride," the minister announced, and James gathered Elena into his arms as the small crowd erupted in cheers. Later, as the reception wound down at the community center decorated with the same autumn colors Elena had hung for the school festival, she found herself on the deck overlooking the harbor with Tommy beside her. "Are you happy, Miss Elena?" Tommy asked, though she was now officially Mrs. Whitmore. Elena looked out over the water, then back at the warm lights of the community center where James was visible through the windows, talking and laughing with their guests. In a few hours, they would go home together, to the house they'd bought together, to the life they'd built together, to the future they'd chosen together. "Yes, sweetheart," she said, pulling Tommy closer to her side. "I'm very, very happy." As if sensing her thoughts, James appeared on the deck behind them, wrapping his arms around both Eleanor and Tommy in a gesture that encompassed their small, perfect family. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. Eleanor leaned back against his chest, Tommy warm and solid beside her, the sounds of their community celebrating their love drifting out from inside. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor in its eternal rhythm, guiding travelers safely home. "Yes," she whispered, understanding finally that home wasn't a place you were born, but a choice you made every day. "I'm ready." And as they walked back toward the lights and warmth of their celebration, Elena knew that whatever challenges the future might bring, she would face them with the two people who mattered most, in the community that had chosen to embrace her, surrounded by a love strong enough to weather any storm. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you enjoyed it, please support the channel, subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments so you don't miss the next episodes. See you in the next story.